right. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, mouths full, hearts full as well, but also let's bring it in. So once again, my name is Courtney Thomas. I'm the Upstate Liaison for Women's Rights and Empowerment Network, and I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker. So today we have Dr. Chandra Childers with us. Dr. Childers is a senior research scientist at the Institute for Women's Policy Research. She's an expert on social stratification and social economic inequality by race and sex. Dr. Childers examines issues related to women and girls of color and job quality. In addition to being cited in the press, including The Nation and The Atlantic, Dr. Childers has given presentations on the findings of IWPR research reports at various policy conferences. Before joining IWPR, Dr. Childers taught multiple undergraduate courses in sociology at Texas Tech University and the University of Washington. She completed her PhD in sociology at the University of Washington. Dr. Childers is a fantastic speaker, and we hope that you will be moved by some of the information she shares with you today. There will also be time for Q&A, so I do hope that you will take some time to assess what you've heard before in our breakout sessions and some of the new research she's bringing here to the table. We are so lucky and thankful to have her with us today. Let's bring up Dr. Childers.
Everybody. All right. I would really like to thank Anne for bringing me. It's such a pleasure to be here to come and to share our research with all of you. As she said, I'm with the Institute for Women's Policy Research, and we have since 1996 been producing our Status of Women in the States reports, where we crunch the numbers and get all the data for every state and the District of Columbia. And we've recently kind of branched out doing Status of Women in the South and our Status of Black Women in the United States. But I want to start out by talking and focusing a little bit more on South Carolina. And so I want to talk about some of the key indicators of women's well-being in South Carolina. And so I thought a good place to start would be on labor force participation, since that seems to be a really hot issue in the state. And so what we have here is I took our data from our 2004 report, our 2016 report, and then I'm going to present data also for the national data so that we can have a little bit of context in looking at the data. And so when we look at labor force participation, one thing that stands out is that labor force participation is relatively low. But not only is it low, it has declined slightly since 2004. So it's actually moving in the wrong direction. And labor force participation is important for a number of reasons. One of the things that we saw, especially after the 1970s through the 1980s, when men's earnings began to stagnate, it was women's movement into the labor force and their earnings that helped families be able to maintain, some level of comfort. It's why household incomes were able to be maintained as the cost of living goes up. Just think about the cost of college, think about the cost of housing, and men's earnings were not continuing to improve. And so women's labor force participation is really important. And then for those households where women's incomes are a significant part of all of household income, from single moms where it constitutes 100% of household income, but even in many married couples, women's incomes are 40% or more of household income, making them co-breadwinners with their husbands or a spouse. So that's really important to look at. The other thing I want to do as we address each of these is I want us to look closely at the breakdown by race and ethnicity so that we can really begin to see where some of these fault lines are going to fall. And so here we've got women's labor force participation by race and ethnicity. And I think probably the most striking thing about this image is how much variation there is across groups of women in labor force participation. So what we see is as African American women have the highest rate of labor force participation of all groups, but they're followed very closely by Hispanic, Native American, and multiracial women. So we've got these big differences across groups. We also have big differences across states. So while the rate for South Carolina is lower than the rate nationally, it's also lower than the rate in many other states. In the District of Columbia, it's 67%. It's 64% in Massachusetts. So when I see these differences across groups of workers and across states, it makes me think that it's not just women making choices, as was discussed on our panel earlier, but there are structural factors that are at play that lead women to either be part of the labor force or not. And so while for some individual women, yes, you may have a choice to stay home and raise your children and not be in the labor force. But for a lot more women, there are other factors that are impacting their ability to stay in the labor force. Again, as our panel talked about, issues of childcare, of the cost of childcare. But also, a lot more women today are also caring for elderly parents or disabled family members, as well as their own children. One of the things we found was that in South Carolina, 17% of working women have an adult or have someone 15 or older with a disability in their household. They're also caring for aging parents. And if they're unable to combine work and family, if they don't have that paid leave time to be able to take care of family, if they're risking losing their job, if they get called to pick their kid up from school because the kid is sick, those are important factors. Are they earning enough to cover the cost of being in the workforce? The cost of childcare, transportation, do they have to buy uniforms? Are there other things they have to purchase? So those are all issues that it's important to think about when we're thinking about the labor force participation rates of women, and employers to think about as they're thinking about their needs for workers. And so even when women are in the labor force, and these are full-time year-round, these are women who are employed full-time year-round. These are the median earnings for women, 2004, 2016, and then nationally in 2016. Again, this is a place where there's not much good news here. One, the earnings for women have actually declined in real dollars. Once you adjust them for inflation, women's earnings have actually gone down about $1,500 a year. And their earnings are already lower than they are for women nationally. And one thing I want to point out here is I hear quite often that in the South generally that the cost of living is lower, so lower wages, you can't really compare national wages to lower wages. But we have also calculated a measure of basic economic sufficiency. And when we look at this measure, it takes into account the cost of housing, the cost of food, the cost of transportation, health insurance, whether or not your job provides a pension, the number of kids and the composition of the household. And what we found is that in South Carolina, still 63% of women are not at that level of economic security that we would want them to be at in order for them to meet all of their needs. And here, this is the same table, but it's broken down by race and ethnicity. And here, these are just the earnings in 2016 for women by race and ethnicity. And this is a pattern you'll get used to seeing as we go through some of these. We'll see where those lines fall. Black and Hispanic women, Native American women have earnings that are lower. So we'll see this pattern. But this is really important, looking at the earnings for the gender wage gap. So first, I just want to look at the gender wage gap for men and women. So again, we have the number nationally. So nationally, women earn 81 cents for every dollar that a man earns across the nation as a whole, and that differs across states. But in South Carolina, we find that women's earnings, they earn an even lower share of men's earnings. So we're talking, it's gone up slightly, but we can see it hasn't gone up very much. And this is since 2004. Now, this is not that unlike the rest of the country either, because one of the things we've seen is we saw a large decrease in the gender wage gap over the 1980s, as much because men's earnings stagnated as because women's earnings went up. But that's where we saw most of the decline. But since about 2001 nationally, there have been very small changes in the gender wage gap. And that's also what we see in South Carolina. Yet, the concern is that it is so much lower than it is nationally. Now, these numbers are comparing all women with all men. And so men's earnings, come down a little bit because earnings for men of color are so much lower for African American and Hispanic men. But if we compare earnings with white males, the largest group in the labor force, by race and ethnicity, then we can kind of get a better sense of where women's earnings are falling relative to their male counterparts. So here again, we can see that African American women, Hispanic women earn substantially less, and this is true nationally as well. They earn substantially less than white males. If we were to compare, and I want to highlight this because one of the arguments put forward is that African American and Hispanic women have less education than white men, and that is true. They do have less education, but they don't have less education than African American and Hispanic men, and they also earn more than African American and Hispanic women. So women in every racial and ethnic group earn less than their male counterparts. That's one thing we see. The other thing is looking at this. The panel this morning discussed some of the key factors in this gender wage gap, and I want to pull them together here to highlight some of these issues. So the largest part of the gender wage gap is the result of occupational and industry segregation. That accounts for about half of it. Men and women work in different occupations, and the occupations that women work in pay less than the occupations that men work in. When we look at the median earnings for workers across occupations by gender, women are 3 times more likely to work in occupations that full-time year-round work would leave a family of 4 below the poverty line than men are. So we know that even though that accounts for some of that is the devaluation of work that's done by women. Those are jobs that are not fairly valued. And to build on something that was said this morning about getting women out of those low-paying jobs, not just being equally represented within them, a lot of those are jobs in the healthcare sector. Those are jobs that aren't going anywhere. So as our population ages and baby boomers begin to retire, the demand for healthcare is increasing rapidly. So really that's going to require that we address the quality of those jobs, and not just because we can't write them off. We're going to have to be able to get people in those jobs. But another piece of the puzzle of women's lower earnings, even when women work in the same jobs as men, they still earn less. When we look at the detailed occupations that contain enough women and men for us to calculate their earnings, out of 120 detailed occupations, men earned at least 5% more than women in 107 of them. And women earned more than men in only 4. So, and in the others, men earned more, they just didn't earn 5% or more above that. So it's not all about occupational segregation. We also know, for example, discrimination is still an issue, especially for women who have children. Audit studies that will send out resumes, and they will keep an eye, they will indicate on the application something like belonging to the PTA. Just any indication that there are children, and they're much less likely to get a call back, and their earnings are much lower. So we know that's working in the labor market. Another factor here is something that I just kind of call the old boys club. We know, for example, again, that men, they get more mentoring in the workplace. They're more likely for their evaluations to give them concrete feedback on how to achieve those next promotions. So those are all kind of factors that are feeding into this wage gap, and they're not mutually exclusive. If, however, we could close gender wage gaps simply for similar men and women, so here, men and women with the same level of education, working the same number of hours, and who live in the same region, we could cut the poverty rate for working women in half. And so here we've got numbers for all employed women and then for employed single mothers. And you can see we could really make a big difference in the poverty rate simply by closing those gender wage gaps. And there are a number of things that can be done at multiple levels, including on the employer side, including from our government, and including workers themselves. We think about the first piece of executive order that President Obama signed. It was a co-worker letting a co-worker know that she was being underpaid. So that allowed her to go and, to demand for herself. Quite often, especially with pay transparency, women don't know they're earning less. So they can't say anything about it. For employers can make it a point of holding their managers accountable for reducing the gender wage gap in their departments. That gives them the freedom to work within their company but still take accountability for getting that gender wage gap closed. So there are a number of different policies and approaches that we could draw on to address that. Here, this is another part which I mentioned before, education. So this is one of where women in South Carolina, we've actually seen advancement. So we have seen an increase in the share, a significant increase in the share of women in South Carolina that have a bachelor's degree or more. One thing I would highlight, though, that this increase comes as much from the in-migration of people with a bachelor's degree as South Carolina actually getting more bachelor's degrees for native-born residents of South Carolina, which I think is an important consideration, something important to keep in mind. And here, this is just, again, that distribution by race and ethnicity. So again, as I said, this is a pattern you're going to get used to seeing, where we see that African American and Hispanic women, and to a lesser degree multiracial women, have much less likely to have a bachelor's degree or more. And this is for women who are age 25 and older. Another place where we've actually seen improvement is the share of women working in business and professional occupations. These, again, are the occupations. They're going to generally require some advanced education, but they're also going to be better paying occupations. They're generally going to be occupations that allow more flexibility, provide more benefits for workers. And so as we see the education of women in South Carolina go up, we would expect to also see the share working. And as the economy is growing and diversifying, that's another thing. The economy is growing and diversifying, and we're seeing women move into some of these better paying occupations. And again, here, just the racial and gender differences. And it's the similar pattern that we have seen. Here I want to take a second and really talk. These are the share of businesses in South Carolina that are owned by women workers. And I think this is an important point because across the South, we have really been seeing women-owned businesses grow and increase. So this has been a really important part of the economy of South Carolina, but of the South generally. And we have seen women of color in particular make large strides in increasing the share of businesses that are woman-owned. This is something that we're very excited about, that makes us very happy, but I also think that there are a couple of things to keep in mind when thinking about these data. One is the reason that women are leaving the labor force and starting their own businesses. what we're seeing is women who either can't make the regular jobs work for them and allow them the flexibility to, again, balance work and family, so they feel like they don't have much of a choice but to go out and start their own businesses. So this is one way they address that. Other issues are women who are just finding it too difficult to find employment that will, pay them what they need to be able to take care of their families. A second issue with this is that even though more and more women are going out and starting their own businesses, they are not having the same access to startup capital, they're not having the same access to credit, which means their businesses tend to be smaller and they tend to be less profitable. And some of that is the segregation of where women start businesses and where men start businesses. Women tend to start business, around health, around education issues, whereas men are more likely to go into construction or professional services where they make more. But it is true also that women get a lot less investment into their businesses, which results in them being smaller and less profitable. Okay. Here is why all of this matters, about why we should care about this. There's a couple of things that I think are really important for us to take all of this data and try to make sense of it all. So what I have here is the racial and ethnic composition of South Carolinians by age group. And one of the things that you'll see here is that as we get younger and younger, the population of South Carolina is getting more and more diverse. And when we think about this in the context of the patterns that we saw earlier of who is getting the most education, who's getting access to the best jobs, who's getting highest levels of pay, and who's getting lower levels of pay, that if we're really wanting to create a healthy, inclusive economy so that everyone gets to thrive and that it does well for the economy, that becomes increasingly unlikely if larger and larger shares of the population are being left out, if they're not being included, if they're not being educated, if they're not being provided with opportunities to start businesses, to live their dreams, to go and chase whatever they want. As long as those opportunities are being limited, you're recreating that racialized and gendered, that you're reproducing that inequality along racial and gender lines. And that is detrimental for everyone. It's detrimental for the economy as a whole. It's detrimental for the social fabric. And it has repercussions that will reverberate and impact everyone. And I think this was referenced, someone referenced this earlier today. This is researchers went and they were able to get tax data, and using this tax data they were able to track parents' income when they were raising their children, and then to follow those children into adulthood and follow their income and look at the relationship between your income when you were growing up and the relationship between your income now. There's a couple of these studies that they do, and they're all really interesting, but I wanted to pull this one out in particular, because what this looks at is how your income growing up, if you were born into and grew up in a home at the lowest income quintile, what is your likelihood of making it into the top income quintile? And again, the fact that these are patterned, that we see these patterns, this tells us that this is not individual people making decisions. There are differences across places and across states that are producing these patterns. And the lighter colors we see, that's where you've got the highest likelihood of mobility. You can be born into a poor family and still make it into a family in the upper quintile, a much higher probability. Whereas the deep red, which includes South Carolina, you've got a much lower probability of being able to be mobile into to that top quintile of income earners. And so again, I think this is an important visual to really think about what we want. And to also think about, there are certain things that they found were related to that differentiated higher mobility from lower mobility areas. So for example, higher inequality is one of the things that is less likely. You're not going to, lower levels of inequality is associated with higher mobility. Less segregation, less residential segregation. Having more social capital, having people interact more, being involved more, being more engaged in their communities. Family structure. But again, they found that the income in the household and the family that you grew up in, that kind of predicts family, having teenage births early. And so it's not an independent factor. It's having those resources when kids are growing up. Kids who grow up, no matter how poor their family is, if they're in communities that provide them with the resources, good quality schools, that was the fifth one. Having access to good quality schools growing up. Those were all things that were predictive of students doing well. And with increases in mobility. And so all of that to say, South Carolina has made some substantial progress. And again, that's assuming our goal is this healthy, integrated community where everyone can thrive, where there are high rates of mobility. So where we've seen progress, increases in educational attainment, specifically the share of the population with a bachelor's degree or more, increased women's business ownership, so we've seen major increases there, and more women working in management and professional occupations. However, and there's still some concerns with those because we definitely want to see those be even higher, but we also see large racial and ethnic disparities across all of our indicators. All of the indicators show these large differences by race and ethnicity. That's one area of concern, especially as the state, as the region, and as the nation becomes more diverse. Low labor force participation rates. Again, people have their own, may have individual reasons for not wanting to be in the labor force, but the fact that the differences across states and across groups is so different, again, that really indicates that there's something structural. It's not just individuals choosing to opt out of the labor market. Low earnings for women working full-time year-round. These are full-time year-round. Any earnings we looked at were for women working full-time year-round, and that their earnings leave them below economic security is an issue. And then the gender wage gap. Nationally, that's a problem, but the fact that it's larger in South Carolina, that also points to another issue and another reason for concern. There we go. So, thank you.
If you have any questions, please raise your hand, and I'll bring you a mic. Hi, my name is Danielle Madden. How do you address, I know you mentioned the bachelor's degree. Mm-hmm. How do you address women getting a bachelor's degree in whatever field that they want to be in, but they're not in that field for years when they get a job? I don't necessarily, example, I have a sister who web designed for 4 years and is literally in a manufacturing world for 10 years. How do you kind of address, or is anything skewed or anything with some of the information or anything like that, because she wants to get back in it, but now that she's been in manufacturing for like 10 years,
yeah.
How does that kind of play a role?
Well, I think there's a couple of things there. One is, I don't think we provide people enough information about their local labor markets and what job opportunities, and I don't know specifics and details, but one thing is I think we need to do a better job of making sure people know, like, you can have a job that pays really well, but if there's only 3 positions open, that's probably not a good place to invest your time or money. And it has to be where you are, or you need to be able and willing to relocate. So like I say, I'm not sure about the specifics, but I think that's one thing that I see is that so many of our young people, they don't know where the growth jobs are. Nobody's pulling down the BLS occupational projections and saying these jobs are projected to decline over the next 10 years. By the time you get that degree, it's on its way out. And like now with the focus on automation and AI, we're seeing a lot of that, at least potential for that coming up. So I think that's part of it. Some of it is certain jobs, we need a better understanding of how you get into those jobs. Like, does it require mentoring? Do you need to know someone who can introduce you to someone? Is it because if it's not a job you can just walk off the street and you don't have someone. I know the advice I was given when I started graduate school was don't pick a graduate school based on the rank of the school. Pick it based on the willingness of faculty to work with you and bring you on their projects. And just information like that. And then I would say probably a third thing is a lot of these private for-profit schools, that's also going to be one of those issues. We've got people going to schools where the quality may not be, and employers know more about the quality than maybe the student does, who's then gone into debt to get that degree. So I think all around we just need more education.
At the beginning, you mentioned that there were 4 or 5 careers that paid either equal or higher for women. Do you have the data on which careers or which occupations those were?
Those were, off the top of my head, I don't remember what they were, but they were not occupations that, they were not the fact that I can't remember them right off the top of my head.
It was something obscure maybe.
Yeah, they weren't the glamorous jobs that, so yeah, but I can definitely give you my card and I can send them to you. Oh.
I'm Greg Masters. Can you comment in terms of this data where you have seen a state or states that have made the most change in terms of these parameters for women disparity over the 2004 to 2016 data that you've seen that have made that equality? In terms of the parameters that you that have made improvements in women's equality in terms of jobs.
I don't know. No one state each state we don't necessarily compare on the same years. Like when I was in Utah, we just compared the 2015 report to the. We compared a different year of report. But also, states may do well in some areas and worse in others. So, I think probably the thing that stands out are some of the states that tend to score better on some. And I'm calling DC a state just because we have to include it in there as one of the municipalities. But, like DC is generally a state that does really well. Maryland is generally one of the states that generally come out on top. And states at the bottom, those tend to be, and here I remember like Louisiana, because the median earnings for African American and Hispanic women there is like $25,000 a year. I think about like Alabama, because again I'm thinking about some of those. We generally in our reports we'll rank like the best 3 states and the worst 3 states for each of the indicators, but those are not always the same states for each indicator. But and all of these reports are online. They're free to download. All of the data, it's there. You can and it's free for anyone who's interested in looking at it.
We have time for one more question. Okay. Come to you. Hi. I was curious about, I'm not exactly sure how to phrase this question, but I'm curious about the psychology of geography in that, and I've lived in this area my whole life, so I can't speak about what the culture is in other areas. But my suspicion is that Southerners, your feet are tied to the ground, in part because it's fear-based. You need your family nearby. If your car breaks, you have to call a brother because you don't have the money to go to the mechanic. So I want to hear your thoughts on that. And I know people move into our area and improve our numbers, but the background that I came from, if you're going to move 3 states away, you may as well go on to Mars. It's the same thing. I mean, that's the mindset. So can you speak to that? I'm not sure there's a question in there.
No. But I think you're absolutely right. I think that the people who are, and this is, you know, in the literature, I read constantly where people are saying, well, they just need to relocate. You have to go where the jobs are. But no, you're absolutely right. If you don't have a nest egg where you can wait 6 months to get a job, you picking up and relocating to where you know nobody, you don't know anybody, that's not. I was able to do that because I was going to graduate school with with guaranteed support for the first 5 years of, I'm guaranteed support at the university. And in that time, I'm going to meet people. I've got a mentor, So, no, I think that's absolutely right. People cannot necessarily, again, without some supports. If we're going to insist that people move where the jobs are, we've got to do something that will allow them to be able to do that. And I think you're speaking to another part of that, because the minute I left home, failure was no longer an option. I could not fail because I was not going back home without that degree. Because again, once you leave, you picked up, you left, you better make it. You better. So no, I think that's exactly right. And I think it's something we don't pay enough attention to when we're addressing these issues. We're just saying, well, the jobs aren't there, move where the jobs are, without offering people what they need to actually be able to do that. Does that? Yeah.
I think if there are no more questions, can we please thank again?
Thank you.